The wind howled across the vast steppe, a relentless, icy whisper that seemed to carry the stories of countless generations. Underneath the endless dome of the sky, the land stretched out in every direction, a canvas of grass and rolling hills, broken only by jagged mountain peaks and winding rivers. This was Central Asia, a place as wild as it was unforgiving, where survival was not a right but a daily battle. For centuries, it had been a stage for clans and tribes, a land of constant movement, shifting alliances, and unending struggle. Here, life was shaped by the land. The steppe was a place of extremes, where summer's sun could bake the earth to dust and winter's cold could steal the breath from your lungs. It was a world that demanded resilience. For those who called it home, the land was both a challenge and a teacher. The grasslands provided for their animals, horses, goats, sheep, but nothing more. Crops would not grow here. To live, people needed to move, to adapt, to rely on their wits and the strength of their bonds. The steppe was not empty. It was alive with the movement of tribes, each carrying its own history, its own pride, and its own scars. Among these were the Tatars, fierce and cunning, the Naimans, with their long traditions of leadership, the Merkits, skilled raiders who struck like shadows in the night. There were the Karaites, whose Christian faith gave them a unique identity in this land of spiritual diversity, and the Mongols, scattered, fragmented, yet destined to rise. These tribes were not just neighbors, they were rivals. Clashes were common, alliances fleeting. A leader's strength was measured by their ability to inspire loyalty in a world where loyalty was often a coin traded for survival. Blood feuds simmered for generations, their origins forgotten but their wounds fresh. For every victory, there was a loss, for every alliance, a betrayal. Yet, even in their rivalries, these tribes shared a connection. They were all children of the steppe, bound by the rhythms of its seasons, by the songs of their ancestors, and by their shared struggles against the forces of nature. The people of the steppe were born in the saddle. Horses were not just tools, they were lifelines, extensions of the soul. A child learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, their legs gripping the sides of their pony as naturally as breathing. The horse carried them through hunts, through battles, through the long migrations that marked their lives. It was said that a steppe warrior could shoot an arrow while galloping at full speed, hitting a target as if guided by the hand of the wind itself. Yet, survival on the steppe demanded more than skill in battle. The tribes developed complex systems of kinship, traditions that gave meaning to their lives and unity to their clans. Songs and stories passed from generation to generation, keeping alive the memories of great leaders, of legendary battles, of the ancestors who had forged their paths in the grasslands. These tales were not just entertainment, they were a lifeline to the past, a map for navigating the hardships of the present. The land itself seemed to shape the spirit of the people. The wide, open spaces taught them to value freedom above all else. The lack of permanent settlements made them distrustful of walls and boundaries. They knew no borders, only horizons. The steppe had no kings, only khans, leaders whose power lasted only as long as they could hold the loyalty of their people. Here, leadership was earned through strength, courage, and cunning, not through titles passed down by blood. Beyond the rivalries and traditions, the steppe was a crossroads. This was where East met West, where merchants carried silks and spices, ideas and technologies along the trade routes that connected the great civilizations of the world. From China came the compass and paper. From the Islamic world, knowledge of astronomy and medicine. From Europe, new metals and techniques. The tribes of the steppe absorbed it all, adapting, learning, growing stronger. But the steppe was also a place of contrasts. It was a land of freedom, yet life could be brutally harsh. Children learned early that weakness was a luxury no one could afford. A boy might lose his father to a raid, a girl her family to hunger. Yet, in this harshness, there was a fierce beauty. The people knew how to endure. They knew how to laugh, to celebrate, to cherish the fleeting moments of joy amidst the struggle. This was the world into which the Mongols were born, a world that demanded everything but also offered boundless possibilities. The tribes of the steppe knew how to move as the seasons dictated, how to strike hard and disappear like smoke. They understood the power of unity, even as they were divided. And they had something else, a resilience forged in hardship, a strength that came from knowing the land could take everything from you and still you could rise again. In this vast, untamed expanse, where the winds carried whispers of glory and defeat, the stage was set for a transformation that no one could have foreseen. The scattered tribes, hardened by centuries of strife and survival, would one day come together under a single leader. The land that had shaped them, tested them, and made them who they were would become the foundation of an empire that would shake the world. But for now, the steppe waited, as it always had, under the wide, endless sky. The child stood at the edge of the river, his breath rising in icy puffs as the morning sun clawed its way over the horizon. He was small for his age, his body lean from hunger, but his eyes, those fierce, piercing eyes, held a fire that refused to be extinguished. Temujin was only 9, but already the weight of survival pressed down on his thin shoulders. His hands clenched a crude fishing spear, his fingers stiff from the cold. Each moment felt like a battle against the world itself, but he was determined not to lose. Not again. He was born into struggle. The year of his birth, 1162, brought no celebrations, no soft lullabies to cradle him into life. His father, Yasugei, was a respected but ruthless chief, leading the small yet proud Borjigin clan. His mother, Holon, was stolen from another man, a bride taken by force in the way of the steppe. Temujin's very existence was carved from violence and hardship, and the land seemed to demand that he earn every breath he took. When Temujin was still a boy, tragedy struck. His father was poisoned by rivals while returning from an important journey. Yasugei's death shattered the fragile security of his family. Without their leader, the Borjigin were vulnerable, and their enemies wasted no time. Overnight, they turned on Holon and her children, casting them out like unwanted refuse. The small family, abandoned by their own people, was left to face the merciless steppe alone. Those were the hardest years. Holon, a woman of immense strength, became the anchor that held them together. She scavenged for roots, hunted small animals, and taught her children to endure. There were nights when they huddled together, too hungry to speak, their stomachs twisting in agony. But even in those moments, Holon's resolve never wavered. She whispered stories of resilience, of ancestors who had faced impossible odds and emerged victorious. Her voice was soft yet unyielding, a lifeline in the darkness. Temujin learned quickly. Hunger sharpened his instincts, and danger honed his courage. He watched his mother's sacrifices, felt the sting of every humiliation they endured, and vowed that one day, no one would dare to treat his family with such contempt. That vow became his fire, a flame that burned brighter with each passing year. As Temujin grew older, his world became even more dangerous. The steppe was a place of constant betrayal, where trust was a scarce and fragile thing. At the age of 16, Temujin married Borte, a young woman from the Anjurat tribe. Their union brought not only love, but also an alliance, his first step toward rebuilding what had been taken from him. Borte's strength and wisdom matched his own, and together, they began to dream of a future where they would not merely survive, but thrive. But the world was not kind to dreamers. Shortly after their marriage, Borte was kidnapped by the Merkids, a rival tribe seeking vengeance for the sins of Temujin's father. For many, such a blow would have been the end. But Temujin was not one to accept defeat. He called upon the allies he had begun to gather, his blood brother Jamuka and the powerful Kariad leader Togrul, and launched a daring raid to rescue his wife. The battle was fierce, but Temujin's determination was unmatched. He fought not only for Borte but for the belief that no one would ever take from him again. When he rode away from the Merkits' camp with Borte by his side, it was more than a victory, it was a declaration. Alliances, however, were as brittle as ice on the steppe. Temujin and Jamuka, once as close as brothers, found themselves on opposite sides as ambitions clashed. Jamuka sought power through tradition, relying on old loyalties and tribal customs. Temujin envisioned something different, unity not through fear or lineage, but through strength and merit. Their friendship turned to rivalry, and in the brutal battles that followed, Temujin's forces were driven into retreat. But even in defeat, he did not crumble. He learned, adapted, and waited for his moment. It came when the steppe tribes, exhausted by endless feuds, began to see Temujin as more than a leader. They saw in him a man who could offer stability, who could lift them from the chaos that had defined their lives for generations. He spoke of a shared purpose, of a people united not by blood but by loyalty. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Temujin's rise was not without bloodshed. He knew the steppe's brutal rules and played them with unflinching precision. Rivals who refused to submit were crushed, their followers absorbed into his growing ranks. Leaders who betrayed him were shown no mercy, their fate serving as warnings to others. But those who pledged their loyalty found a leader who protected them fiercely, who rewarded their trust with opportunities to rise. By the time he called the Great Kurultai, a council of tribal leaders, Temujin had done what no one before him had managed. He had forged the fractious tribes of the Mongolian steppe into a single, unified force. When the council proclaimed him Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the winds of the steppe seemed to echo his name. It was not a name born of inheritance but of struggle, a title earned through unrelenting determination. In the vast expanse of the steppe, under skies that had witnessed centuries of strife, a new force had emerged. Temujin, the boy who had once fished for scraps to feed his starving family, now commanded the loyalty of thousands. His journey had been forged in fire, every step marked by loss and perseverance. The world would soon come to know the name Genghis Khan, but for now, the steppe itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the storm to come. The sun rose slowly over the plains, painting the grasslands with shades of gold and crimson. Thousands of men stood gathered in a vast circle, their voices hushed, their eyes fixed on the figure at the center. It was an extraordinary sight, warriors from rival clans and former enemies standing shoulder to shoulder, bound by something greater than old feuds. They had not come for battle, nor to mourn. They had come to make history. Temujin stood tall, his weathered face framed by the furs of his robe, his gaze steady as it swept across the crowd. He had known every kind of struggle, the sting of betrayal, the taste of hunger, the weight of survival. Yet here he was, not as a broken man but as a conqueror, a unifier, a force that could no longer be ignored. Today, the tribes of the Mongolian steppe would become something they had never been before, one. The murmurs of the crowd faded as Temujin raised his hand. The silence that followed was as vast as the steppe itself. Slowly, one by one, tribal leaders stepped forward, offering their oaths. Some knelt willingly, their heads bowed in respect. Others hesitated, the memory of lost wars and broken alliances still fresh in their minds, but they too submitted. It was not submission to a man but to a vision of unity, of strength, of a future that could not exist in their fractured world. When the last warrior had pledged his loyalty, Temujin's voice rang out, clear and commanding, carried by the wind to every corner of the gathering. From that moment, he would no longer be Temujin, the man who had clawed his way from nothing. He was now Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. The title was not simply a crown, it was a declaration. It meant that the days of tribal rivalries and endless cycles of revenge were over. From that day, the Mongols were one people, bound by a purpose far greater than themselves. But unity was not enough. Genghis Khan knew that the strength of his empire would depend on order, and order demanded laws. He issued the Yasa, a set of rules that would guide the Mongols in peace and war alike. The Yasa was simple but absolute. It outlawed theft and adultery, demanded loyalty to one's leader, and established severe punishments for betrayal and cowardice. Yet it was more than a list of punishments, it was a promise of fairness. Everyone, from the lowest herder to the mightiest general, was subject to the same rules. Genghis Khan understood that loyalty grew from trust, and trust grew from justice. The reforms didn't stop there. Genghis Khan reorganized his people, not by tribes, but by merit and loyalty. Family ties and old allegiances no longer mattered. Warriors were grouped into units of 10, called Arban, which formed the foundation of his army. 10 Arbans made a Jagan, 10 Jagans a Mingan, and 10 Minghans a Tuman, a unit of 10,000. Each unit functioned as a family, sharing resources, victories, and losses. The structure ensured discipline, unity, and adaptability on the battlefield. The Mongol army became an unstoppable force, not just because of its size, but because of its innovation. Genghis Khan had learned from years of fighting on the steppe that speed and precision could win battles before they began. Every soldier was a skilled horseman, and every horseman was an archer, able to rain arrows down on their enemies with deadly accuracy. But the Mongols were not limited to brute force. Genghis Khan sought out the best minds from the lands he conquered, engineers, strategists, and craftsmen, absorbing their knowledge into his empire. His soldiers used siege engines to bring down fortified cities, psychological tactics to break the spirit of their enemies, and a network of spies to stay one step ahead. Yet even in the midst of his military might, Genghis Khan's reforms reached beyond war. He established a postal system, the yam, which connected the vast reaches of his growing empire. Riders could carry messages across hundreds of miles in days, ensuring that information flowed quickly and efficiently. Trade flourished under his rule, with caravans traveling safely along routes that had once been plagued by bandits. Genghis Khan knew that an empire was not built on conquest alone. It required stability, communication, and trust. The day of the Kurultai ended with celebrations that lit up the steppe like a firestorm. Warriors feasted under the stars, their laughter mingling with the distant calls of wolves. But at the center of it all, Genghis Khan sat quietly, his mind already racing ahead. The unification of the Mongols was only the beginning. The world beyond the steppe awaited, vast and untamed. And for a man who had turned rivals into allies and outcasts into warriors, no horizon seemed too far to conquer. The winds of the steppe carried the distant thunder of hooves, a sound that grew louder with each passing moment. It was not the gentle rhythm of a few riders, but a storm of warriors, thousands strong, sweeping across the grasslands like an unstoppable tide. At the head of this fearsome wave was Genghis Khan, his figure upright on his horse, his piercing gaze fixed on the horizon. He wasn't just a man leading an army, he was a force reshaping the world. The steppe had always been a land of rivals, its endless plains divided by blood feuds and ancient grudges. But Genghis Khan had a vision far beyond the petty disputes that had long splintered his people. To control the steppe, he would have to confront its fiercest tribes, each with its own pride, its own scars, and its own will to survive. The Tatars, the Merkits, the Naimans, they were more than enemies. They were obstacles standing in the way of unity, of destiny. The Tatars were the first to feel his wrath. They had been a thorn in his side for years, their betrayal of his father a wound that never fully healed. But this was not a campaign for revenge, it was a calculated step toward control. The Tatars were cunning and formidable, but they underestimated Genghis Khan. He approached them not with brute force, but with strategy, luring them into a trap that would seal their fate. When the battle began, it was swift and merciless. His warriors encircled the Tatars, cutting off their escape and striking with the precision of a predator closing in on its prey. By the time the sun set, the Tatars were broken, their leaders executed, and their people absorbed into the growing Mongol Empire. For the Merkits, the encounter was deeply personal. Years earlier, they had stolen Borte, Genghis Khan's wife, in a cruel raid meant to humiliate him. Though he had rescued her, the memory of that violation burned like a brand on his soul. When he rode against them, it was with a fury that could not be contained. The Merkits fought fiercely, their warriors skilled and desperate, but they were no match for the relentless discipline of the Mongol forces. Genghis Khan's army moved like a single, living organism, striking with speed and force, never allowing the enemy a moment to regroup. When the dust settled, the Merkits' power was shattered, their people scattered. It was more than a victory, it was a message to all who dared challenge him. The Naimans were a different kind of enemy. They were powerful, resourceful, and proud, their leaders known for their wisdom as well as their strength. They saw themselves as equals to Genghis Khan, perhaps even his superiors. But where the Naimans relied on tradition and alliances, Genghis Khan brought innovation and unity. The battle against the Naimans was not a single clash, but a series of maneuvers, each designed to weaken their defenses and sap their resolve. His army moved with a precision that seemed almost supernatural, striking where the enemy was weakest and disappearing before they could retaliate. When the final confrontation came, the Naimans fought with the ferocity of cornered wolves. But even their courage was no match for the storm that Genghis Khan had unleashed. When their leader, Taian Khan, fell, the Naimans' resistance crumbled. Once again, the defeated were not slaughtered but absorbed, their strength added to the Mongol horde. Each victory brought more than land or loot, it brought people. Warriors who had once fought against Genghis Khan now fought for him, bound by his charisma, his vision, and his ability to reward loyalty. The steppe, once fractured into countless tribes and factions, was becoming a single, unified force. Genghis Khan understood that control of the steppe was not just about power, it was about survival. The grasslands were the lifeblood of his people, their pastures feeding the horses that carried them to victory, their vastness providing both shelter and opportunity. But these conquests were not without cost. For every village captured, for every tribe subdued, there were lives lost, families torn apart. Genghis Khan himself bore the weight of these sacrifices, his victories tempered by the knowledge of what they had required. Yet he pressed on, driven by a belief that the unity of the steppe was worth any price. To him, it was not just about conquest, it was about building something enduring, something that could rise above the endless cycle of war and vengeance that had plagued the land for generations. The control of the steppe was not simply a matter of military might, it was a masterstroke of strategy. Genghis Khan's victories ensured not only his dominance but the security of his people. With the Tatars, Merkits, and Naimans defeated, the steppe was no longer a patchwork of rivalries but a foundation for something far greater. The winds that once carried the cries of scattered battles now carried the name of Genghis Khan, whispered with awe and fear across the endless plains. And still, the horizon called. The caravan moved steadily along the ancient Silk Road, its wagons laden with precious goods, silks from the east, spices, and gems destined for the great markets of Central Asia. The merchants spoke in low voices, wary of the dangers that lurked on the horizon. But their unease came not from bandits or rival traders, it came from the whispers spreading across the land. Whispers of a force unlike any the world had ever seen. A force that had come from the distant steppe and left ruin in its wake. The Khwarezmian Empire stood at the crossroads of civilization, a beacon of wealth, culture, and power. Its cities, Samarkand, Bokhara, Urgench, were jewels of Islamic scholarship and trade, their walls towering over bustling bazaars and serene mosques. Yet beneath the surface of prosperity, arrogance brewed. The ruler, Shah Allah ad-Din Muhammad II, underestimated the storm approaching his borders. When Genghis Khan sent envoys bearing gifts, seeking a peaceful trade alliance, the Shah's pride turned to recklessness. He seized the Mongol envoys, killing some and mutilating others, sending their disfigured bodies back as an insult. For Genghis Khan, this act was not just an affront, it was an unforgivable violation. In the steppe, hospitality and the sanctity of envoys were sacred. The Shah's betrayal ignited a fury within him that would soon consume the Khwarezmian Empire. The Mongol army moved like a shadow, swift and silent, crossing mountains and deserts with an ease that defied understanding. Their strategies were as ruthless as they were brilliant. Splitting his forces into multiple divisions, Genghis Khan ensured that no city, no army, no stronghold could predict their movements. As the Mongols descended upon the Khwarezmian lands, the air seemed to thicken with dread. The first city to fall was Bokhara. The gates of Bokhara were massive, built to withstand the sieges of armies far less determined than the Mongols. Yet the defenders were unprepared for the scale of the assault. The Mongols laid siege with precision, their siege engines hammering the walls day and night. When the walls finally crumbled, the warriors poured in like a flood, unstoppable and merciless. Inside the city, chaos erupted. The defenders fought valiantly, but the Mongols' discipline and superior tactics overwhelmed them. Those who surrendered were spared only temporarily, their fate sealed as part of Genghis Khan's grim lesson. The city's leaders were paraded before him, forced to their knees as the conqueror delivered his cold judgment. "I am the flail of God," he declared. "If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like meat upon you. And then, like a vengeful tide, his forces razed the city, leaving behind ash and silence. Samarkand, the shining jewel of the Khwarezmian Empire, was next. Its people, hearing of Bokhara's fate, hoped their mighty walls and larger armies would save them. But the Mongols were not deterred. They encircled the city, cutting off every escape route, every hope of reinforcement. As the siege dragged on, desperation set in among Samarkand's defenders. Starvation loomed, and their once mighty will began to falter. When the Mongols finally breached the city, the slaughter that followed was relentless. Samarkand's treasures were looted, its scholars and artisans enslaved, and its population decimated. Genghis Khan's wrath did not end with the cities. He pursued the Shah himself, driving him into a panicked flight across his crumbling empire. The Shah fled from one stronghold to another, each time finding no refuge from the relentless Mongol pursuit. At last, broken and abandoned, he died in obscurity on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea. His empire, once proud and mighty, was reduced to ruins. But the conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was not just a tale of destruction. It was a turning point, a moment when the world realized the full scope of Mongol power. The Islamic civilization, with its centuries of scholarship, art, and trade, reeled from the impact. Libraries were burned, mosques desecrated, and cities that had stood as centers of knowledge were reduced to rubble. The devastation was so profound that it echoed across the generations, a scar that would never fully heal. For the Mongols, the conquest was a statement, a demonstration of what awaited those who defied Genghis Khan. It was not cruelty for its own sake, but a calculated strategy, one that ensured submission before resistance. The survivors carried the tales of Mongol might far and wide, spreading fear to lands that had not yet felt their wrath. The rivers of Central Asia ran red, and the skies were choked with the smoke of burning cities. But amidst the destruction, Genghis Khan's empire grew stronger, absorbing the knowledge and skills of the lands it conquered. The artisans of Bokhara, the engineers of Samarkand, the merchants of Khwarezm, many of them were spared, taken to serve the Mongol cause. Even in ruin, there was renewal, a strange and brutal paradox that defined Genghis Khan's vision. The conquest of the Khwarezmian Empire was not the end, but a beginning, a doorway to new horizons, new battles, and new empires. For those who lived through it, it was a nightmare that reshaped their world forever. For Genghis Khan, it was proof that no boundary, no enemy, no kingdom could stand against the will of the steppe. The icy winds of the Caucasus howled through the valleys, carrying with them a foreboding sense of unease. In the distance, the Mongol banners fluttered against the pale sky, their ominous presence a stark reminder that no land, no people, were beyond their reach. To the Armenians and Georgians, these invaders seemed less like men and more like a force of nature, unstoppable and indifferent to the lives they swept away. The mountains that had protected these lands for centuries seemed to offer no shelter now. Genghis Khan's generals, Subutai and Jib, led their warriors with a precision that left their enemies scrambling in confusion. The Mongols didn't simply march into the Caucasus, they wove through its rugged terrain as though it had been their home for generations. They came not in waves, but as a tide, silent and swift, overwhelming entire armies before their enemies could understand the scale of the threat. The first encounters were brutal. Georgian and Armenian forces, renowned for their valor, met the Mongols on the field of battle, determined to defend their homeland. But the Mongols brought with them not just superior tactics, but a chilling efficiency. Their cavalry moved with an agility that defied logic, encircling their enemies and striking from all sides. They feigned retreats, drawing their opponents into ambushes where arrows rained down with deadly precision. Those who survived spoke of the Mongols' eerie silence in battle, as though the very act of killing was a grim art they had perfected. Victory after victory marked the Mongols' path, but it was not only their military prowess that left an indelible mark, it was the fear they cultivated. Entire towns surrendered at the mere sight of their banners, hoping to avoid the horrors that awaited those who resisted. This fear was not born of rumor alone, it was carefully orchestrated. The Mongols allowed survivors to flee, spreading tales of destruction that grew with each retelling. Cities that dared to resist were razed so thoroughly that they became cautionary tales for generations. The Mongols understood that terror was as powerful a weapon as any sword or arrow. From the Caucasus, the Mongols turned their gaze toward the west, their ambitions stretching into the vast, unfamiliar lands of Europe. The steppe warriors moved with the confidence of conquerors, unafraid of the unknown. Their first steps into Eastern Europe were marked by a calculated ferocity, testing the resolve of their new adversaries. The Russian principalities, fragmented and weakened by internal strife, were easy prey. But the real test of Mongol strength came at the Battle of Khalkha River. The Khalkha River was no ordinary battlefield. It became a stage for one of the most chilling displays of Mongol strategy and psychological warfare. The Mongols, led by Subutai and Jebe, encountered a coalition of Russian princes who had hastily united to face this unprecedented threat. Though the Russians outnumbered them, the Mongols showed no fear. They feigned retreat, drawing the eager Russian forces deeper into unfamiliar territory. Each step the Russians took was a step closer to disaster, yet they pursued the Mongols with reckless determination, their confidence blinding them to the trap being set. When the time came to strike, the Mongols unleashed their full fury. Their army, once scattered and retreating, turned on the Russians with devastating precision. The princes who had thought themselves hunters became the hunted, their forces surrounded and annihilated. The chaos of the battlefield was unbearable, horses screamed, men fell, and the river itself seemed to run red with the blood of the fallen. But the true horror came after the battle. The captured Russian nobles were subjected to a fate designed not just to punish, but to haunt the memories of those who heard of it. The Mongols, masters of psychological warfare, crushed the Russian princes under wooden planks, using their suffering as a grim banquet table. It was a grotesque spectacle, a chilling reminder that defiance against the Mongols came at an unbearable price. As the Mongols advanced further into Eastern Europe, they left behind not just destruction but an indelible shadow of fear. Villages were abandoned before they arrived, their people fleeing into forests and mountains, hoping to escape the wrath that seemed inevitable. The Mongols were not simply invaders, they became a legend, a terror whispered about in the dead of night, a force that seemed unstoppable. For the Mongols, these victories were more than conquests. They were declarations of their dominance, each battle a statement that no kingdom, no army, no land was beyond their reach. Their march westward was not driven by greed alone, but by a relentless desire to shape the world in their image. And for those who stood in their way, there was no mercy, only the promise of devastation. The winter air bit sharply against the exposed skin of the Mongol warriors as they gathered at the base of the towering walls of Zhongdu. The city, the jewel of the Jin dynasty, stood defiant under the pale sky. Its golden roofs glimmered even under siege, a stubborn declaration of its wealth and power. But behind those walls, fear grew like a shadow. The Mongols had come, and their reputation preceded them. The early campaigns in northern China had already tested the resolve of the Jin dynasty. The Mongols, though outsiders to the complexities of Chinese warfare, adapted with an unsettling swiftness. They studied their enemy, understanding the fortified cities and intricate defenses that had long shielded the dynasties of China. What they lacked in numbers and traditional siege techniques, they more than made up for in ingenuity and sheer willpower. The Jin dynasty, entrenched in their strongholds, had underestimated the force that rose from the steppes. Their armies, vast but weighed down by years of bureaucracy and internal corruption, crumbled like sand before the relentless Mongol onslaught. The open plains of northern China became battlefields soaked in blood, where Mongol cavalry shattered Jin formations with precision. Villages burned, and refugees fled southward, carrying tales of the horsemen who struck without warning and left no survivors. But it was not the fields that truly tested the Mongols, it was the cities. Zhongdu, the Jin capital, loomed large, its walls seemingly impenetrable. For years, it had withstood the ambitions of its enemies, a fortress of prosperity and pride. Yet the Mongols saw the walls not as a barrier but as a challenge. They had learned from every battle, refining their siege techniques to match the enormity of their ambition. The assault on Zhongdu began with the methodical construction of siege engines. Towering trebuchets, battering rams, and scaling ladders rose under the relentless labor of the Mongol engineers. Fires blazed in the cold nights as blacksmiths worked tirelessly to create the tools of destruction. The thunderous sound of boulders striking the walls echoed for weeks, shaking the very foundations of the city. Inside Zhongdu, the people huddled in fear. Food supplies dwindled, and the once proud Jin nobility whispered of surrender. The Mongols tightened their grip, cutting off all hope of reinforcements or escape. They unleashed firebombs, a terrifying innovation that turned the night sky into a canvas of flame. Arrows darkened the air, falling with unerring accuracy upon defenders who dared to show themselves on the battlements. When the walls finally gave way, the Mongols surged into the city with the ferocity of a flood breaking a dam. The streets, once filled with merchants and scholars, ran red with the blood of its defenders. Those who resisted were cut down without hesitation. Those who surrendered faced uncertain fates, enslavement or execution. The Jin emperor fled, leaving his people to face the wrath of the conquerors. Yet amidst the carnage, the Mongols demonstrated a calculated pragmatism. Artisans and engineers were spared, their skills deemed valuable to the Mongol war machine. Libraries were looted not for destruction but for knowledge, as the Mongols understood the power of the written word. The conquest of Zhongdu was not merely a victory, it was a statement to the world that even the mightiest of dynasties could fall before the will of Genghis Khan. The Jin dynasty's collapse did not mark the end of Mongol campaigns in China. The Xia, a smaller but no less proud kingdom, faced the same storm. Genghis Khan demanded their submission, but the Xia rulers hesitated, believing their desert fortresses and natural defenses would protect them. They were wrong. The Mongols, unyielding and adaptable, crossed the harsh terrain with an ease that defied logic. City after city fell, their walls no match for Mongol ingenuity and determination. And yet, even as they conquered, the Mongols were not blinded by rage or arrogance. They were calculating in their alliances and rivalries, particularly with the Song dynasty to the south. The Song, though wary of the Mongols, saw in them a potential ally against their mutual enemy, the Jin. For a time, the Song and the Mongols coexisted in a fragile dance of diplomacy and mistrust. The Mongols respected the Song's wealth and culture, but they also eyed it as a prize waiting to be taken. The campaigns in China were unlike anything the Mongols had faced before. The terrain, the fortifications, the sheer scale of the land, it tested them in ways no other campaign had. But it also forged them into an even more formidable force. They learned not just to conquer but to adapt, to wield fear as a weapon and to use the resources of their enemies to fuel their own ambitions. As the smoke of Zhongdu's ruins faded into the horizon, the Mongols pressed on, their sights set on greater challenges. For them, there was no pause, no rest. The conquest of China was not just a chapter in their story, it was a proving ground, a crucible that sharpened the blade of their empire. The Jin and Xia dynasties had stood as symbols of power and permanence, and the Mongols had swept them aside like dust. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the endless steppes as if the heavens themselves mourned the passing of a titan. Genghis Khan, the man who had forged the greatest empire the world had ever seen, lay still, his breath silenced by the weight of years and wounds. The warriors who surrounded him, men hardened by countless battles, now knelt in quiet reverence. The Khan was gone, and with him, an era of unyielding conquest and ambition seemed to dim. The world beneath his rule trembled with uncertainty. The man who had united the fractious tribes of the Mongolian steppe, who had brought empires to their knees and redrawn the map of civilization, was no longer there to guide them. But even in death, his influence lingered, an unbreakable thread woven into the fabric of history. His burial was shrouded in secrecy, as was his wish. Legends speak of a procession so vast that it left no witnesses, rivers were diverted, forests cut down, and every trace of his resting place erased to preserve his sanctity. Some whispered that those who attended the burial were themselves silenced, their sacrifice ensuring the Khan's peace in eternity. Yet the silence that followed his passing was anything but peaceful. The empire he had built with blood and fire now faced the delicate question of succession. Genghis Khan, a master of strategy, had foreseen this moment and worked tirelessly to prepare his sons. But preparation did not guarantee harmony. The steppe had always been a land of fierce rivalries, and even among brothers, loyalty was often tempered by ambition. His empire, vast and diverse, was divided among his 4 sons, Joki, Chagatai, Ogidi, and Talyui. Each son inherited a portion of the Khan's legacy, and with it, the immense responsibility of upholding the laws and vision their father had laid down. Yet even in this division, the seeds of discord were sown. Joki, the eldest, had always been a source of tension, his lineage questioned due to rumors surrounding his mother's capture by the Merkits. Though Genghis Khan had declared him legitimate, the whispers of doubt lingered, creating rifts with his brothers, particularly the hot-tempered Chagatai. Despite these tensions, Ogidi, the 3rd son, emerged as the chosen successor. Genghis Khan had seen in him a steady hand, a balance between ambition and restraint. Under the Yasa, the code of laws established by the Great Khan, the decision was clear: Ogidi would become the Great Khan, and the unity of the empire would hinge on the loyalty of his brothers and generals. But loyalty was a fragile thing, and the weight of empire pressed heavily upon the shoulders of all who bore it. The division of the empire gave rise to what would later be known as the 4 Khanates, each a reflection of the vastness and diversity of the Mongol realm. To the west, the Golden Horde, ruled by Joki's descendants, stretched across the steppes of Russia and into Eastern Europe. To the south, the Chagatai Khanate took root in Central Asia, its rulers inheriting the rugged mountains and deserts that had tested the Mongols' mettle in their early campaigns. The Ilkhanate, born of Hulagu's later conquests, would claim Persia and the Middle East, while the Great Khanate, centered in Mongolia and China, remained the heart of the empire, its legacy tied to the successors of Ogidi. But even as these Khanates rose, the unity that Genghis Khan had fought so hard to create began to fray. Rivalries between brothers and cousins grew, their ambitions colliding like storms on the horizon. The very strengths of the empire, its diversity, its vastness, became sources of tension. Communication across the sprawling realm was a monumental task, and the differences in culture, language, and governance among the conquered peoples only deepened the divisions. Yet, for a time, the vision of Genghis Khan endured. Ogidi, the new Great Khan, continued his father's work, leading campaigns that expanded the empire's reach even further. The Mongols rode into Europe, their thunderous charge shaking the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland. The network of trade and communication established under Genghis Khan flourished, connecting the farthest corners of the empire and fostering an exchange of goods, ideas, and technologies that transformed the medieval world. But even in these moments of triumph, the shadow of the Khan's absence loomed large. His sons and grandsons, though mighty in their own right, could not match the singular vision and authority that had held the empire together. The steppe, ever restless, demanded a leader of unwavering strength and unity. Without Genghis Khan, the empire was a bow without a single hand to pull its string, its power immense but its aim uncertain. As the sun dipped below the horizon on the day of his passing, the steppe seemed to hold its breath. Genghis Khan had left behind more than an empire. He had left a legacy of transformation, a testament to what could be achieved through sheer will and determination. But he had also left questions, challenges, and a world forever changed by his ambition. His heirs would carry his name, his laws, and his dream, but the weight of his shadow would follow them always. The air was crisp and silent, save for the rhythmic pounding of hooves against the frozen earth. A lone rider streaked across the steppe, his silhouette stark against the endless horizon. Strapped to his back was a leather satchel, its contents critical, carrying messages that could command armies or save lives. This was no ordinary journey. It was a link in a vast network, a lifeline that bound the Mongol Empire together, forged by the will of Ogidi Khan. Ogidi, the son chosen by Genghis Khan to succeed him, carried the weight of an empire that spanned continents. His father's shadow loomed large, but Ogidi was not merely a custodian of what had been built. He was a ruler in his own right, determined to expand the empire's borders and solidify its foundation. Where Genghis had conquered, Ogidi sought to sustain, weaving the fabric of an empire into something that could endure. Under his reign, the Mongol Empire became more than a collection of territories, it became a connected world. His greatest creation, the Yam postal system, was a marvel of efficiency and innovation. Stretching across thousands of miles, it allowed messages to travel at a speed that seemed almost supernatural. Relay stations, spaced at regular intervals, were stocked with fresh horses and provisions. Riders could exchange mounts in minutes, their urgency never slowed by fatigue. The Yam was more than communication, it was control, a demonstration that no matter how far the border stretched, the Khan's hand could reach every corner. Even as Ogidi built bridges of communication, his gaze remained fixed outward, to lands yet unconquered. His armies marched with the same unyielding determination that had characterized his father's campaigns. In the west, the Mongols pushed into Russia and Eastern Europe, their banners striking fear into the hearts of kings and commoners alike. The Russian principalities, fractured and weak, fell like autumn leaves. Cities like Kiev and Ryazan were reduced to ashes, their defenders swept aside by the relentless tide of Mongol cavalry. But it was the campaign into Eastern Europe that sent shivers across Christendom. In 1241, the Mongols surged into Poland and Hungary, their movements swift and precise. The Battle of Liegnitz became a grim testament to their power. On a cold April morning, a coalition of European forces, Poles, Teutonic Knights, and others, gathered to halt the Mongol advance. The fields were thick with the scent of damp earth and the tension of soldiers readying for a fight they barely understood. The Mongols struck with terrifying clarity. Feigned retreats lured the European forces into traps, where the full might of Mongol archery and cavalry was unleashed. Arrows rained down in a deadly hail, their precision unmatched. When the melee began, it was chaos. The European forces, brave but disorganized, crumbled under the Mongol onslaught. By day's end, the battlefield was strewn with bodies, the Mongols standing victorious. They collected the severed ears of their enemies, piling them as grim trophies, a warning to all who dared resist. Yet, the terror of the Mongols was not born solely from their battlefield tactics. It was the psychological warfare they mastered that set them apart. They struck swiftly and without warning, spreading tales of their invincibility and ruthlessness. Villages would surrender without a fight, preferring servitude over slaughter. Their reputation was as potent a weapon as their arrows. In the heart of the empire, Ogidi's reign was marked not just by bloodshed but by a vision of prosperity. He oversaw the construction of Karakorum, a city that stood as the empire's nerve center. Unlike the transient camps of his father's time, Karakorum was a symbol of permanence, its streets filled with merchants, craftsmen, and ambassadors from every corner of the known world. The city hummed with life, its markets offering goods from Persia, China, and beyond. It was here that the threads of the empire were drawn together, a place where languages mingled and cultures intersected. But the cost of expansion was high, and the strain began to show. As Ogidi's armies pressed ever farther, the challenges of governing such an immense realm became clear. Resources were stretched thin, and the loyalties of distant generals grew tenuous. Still, Ogidi pressed on, his ambition tempered only by his humanity. Stories tell of a man who could laugh heartily, drink deeply, and yet rule with the steel of his father. His leadership was a paradox of warmth and ferocity, of vision and pragmatism. The campaigns in Europe, though devastating, were ultimately halted, not by force of arms, but by fate itself. Word of Ogidi's death in 1241 reached the Mongol armies, calling them back to the steppe. The Khan was gone, and with him, the momentum of their conquest seemed to falter. Europe, battered and terrified, breathed a collective sigh of relief, though the scars of the Mongol invasion would linger for generations. Ogidi's reign was a bridge between eras, a time of consolidation and expansion that both honored his father's legacy and set the stage for what was to come. The fields of Liegnitz, the smoking ruins of Kiev, and the bustling streets of Karakorum all bore witness to a leader who understood the delicate balance of power and connection. Though his time was brief, his impact was indelible, his vision etched into the vast tapestry of the Mongol Empire. The silence of the night was broken only by the crackle of flames licking the air as the once great city of Baghdad burned. The cries of a civilization on the brink of extinction echoed through the streets, drowning out the sound of hooves as Mongol soldiers swept through the heart of the city. The golden age of the Abbasid Caliphate was over. The city that had been the beacon of knowledge, culture, and power in the Muslim world was falling, not with a whimper, but with a roar. In the wake of destruction, the river Tigris ran black with ink, its waters stained by the thousands of priceless manuscripts that had once filled the libraries and schools. Nothing could save Baghdad now, not wealth, nor history, nor hope. This was the consequence of Monk Khan's vision, an empire ever expanding, ever shifting. His reign was marked by an unrelenting drive to push the boundaries of the Mongol realm into the lands of the Middle East. The Mongols, under his leadership, were no longer just conquerors of the steppes or the Far East. Their gaze had turned westward, their ambition boundless. Monk had inherited not just his father's legacy but a powerful thirst to leave his mark on the world. In the year 1258, the Mongol armies descended upon Baghdad. The city had once been a jewel of the Islamic world, with its majestic mosques, bustling markets, and scholars who had shaped the fate of the ancient world. But now, it was a symbol of resistance, and yet, it was also a city caught in the crosshairs of history. As the Mongols encircled the walls of the city, the defenders inside knew the end was near, but they could not have known how brutal the price would be. For weeks, the Mongol siege tightened its grip. The city's grand fortifications proved no match for the relentless Mongol ingenuity and siege tactics. The walls crumbled, the gates fell, and the fury of the Mongol soldiers surged through. What followed was a storm of destruction. The Caliph, Al-Mustasim, was captured, and in a cruel twist, he was executed, his death sealing the fate of Baghdad. The city's treasures, once thought indestructible, were looted or destroyed. As the city burned, the Mongols left in their wake a haunting silence that would never again be filled with the vibrant life of its golden age. The fall of Baghdad marked the end of an era, but it also signaled the dawn of a new one under the Ilkhanate. Hulagu, Monk's brother, had been entrusted with the task of conquering the Middle East. His success in Baghdad would become his defining moment, but it was not the end. From the ashes of that fallen city, Hulagu would forge the Ilkhanate, a Mongol realm that stretched from the Iranian plateau into the heart of the Middle East. The lands once ruled by the caliphs now belonged to the descendants of Genghis Khan, and under Hulagu's watchful eye, the empire continued to grow. With every conquest, the Mongol presence in the region grew more entrenched, a reminder of the new order they had brought. Yet, the Mongols' dominance in the Middle East was never uncontested. The Mamluks, the military caste that ruled Egypt, stood as the last bastion of resistance. The Mongols, however, were relentless, their campaign moving swiftly through the region. They had already swept through Persia and Iraq, and the Mamluks knew they were next. They were no strangers to battle and had experienced the horrors of Mongol warfare firsthand, but they were also driven by the fierce desire to protect their homeland. In 1260, the two forces would meet at the Battle of Ain Jalut. The battlefield, stretched out beneath a burning sun, would become the stage for one of the most pivotal moments in the history of the Mongol conquests. The Mongols, led by Hulagu's generals, advanced with their typical ferocity, their archers poised to rain death upon the Mamluks. The Mongols' reputation was terrifying, their cavalry seemingly invincible, and their strategy flawless. But on this day, the tide of history would turn. The Mamluks, led by the skilled General Kutuz and the fiery Baibars, knew that the Mongols' strength lay in their speed and their terrifyingly efficient tactics. But they also understood that the Mongol forces, though skilled, were not invulnerable. The Mamluks fought with the desperation of men who knew that their survival depended on their victory. As the battle raged, the Mamluks fought fiercely, pushing back against the Mongol lines. The clash was brutal, the ground shaking beneath the weight of horses and men, the air thick with the sound of weapons clashing. But it was in the heat of this intense combat that the Mongols made a fatal misstep. The Mongols had relied on their usual feigned retreats to draw their enemies into traps, but this time, the Mamluks stood firm. The Mongol lines wavered, and the Mamluks seized the opportunity. The Mongol forces, already stretched thin by the long campaign, found themselves outflanked. Hulagu's generals were forced to retreat, and the Mongols' first significant defeat in the Middle East became a turning point. In the aftermath of Ain Jalut, the Mamluks' victory reverberated across the Middle East. It was a triumph not just of arms, but of resolve. The Mongols, so long undefeated, had been humbled. It proved that even the greatest empire could be challenged. The victory at Ain Jalut marked the beginning of the Mongol Empire's retreat from the heart of the Middle East. Hulagu's dreams of total domination were dashed, and the Ilkhanate, though still powerful, never fully realized its potential in the region. Though the Mongols would continue to hold sway over parts of the Middle East, the Battle of Ain Jalut proved that empires could be fragile. It was a reminder that even the unstoppable force of the Mongols could be turned back by a determined people fighting for their homeland. As the smoke cleared and the battlefield grew quiet, the legacy of the Mongol invasion was left not just in the ruins they had created, but in the spark of resistance that had lit the flame of defiance. The Mamluks' victory at Ain Jalut would forever change the balance of power in the Middle East and set the stage for a new chapter in the long saga of the Mongol Empire. The struggle for power had already shaped so many lives, and Kublai Khan stood at the heart of it, ready to carve his name into the fabric of history. But his path was not smooth. It was jagged and filled with the weight of expectations, torn between loyalty to his bloodline and his vision for the future. The winds of fate had already whispered his name, but the battles, both on the battlefield and within his own heart, had just begun. Kublai, grandson of the great Genghis Khan, inherited a world fractured by conflict. The Mongol Empire, vast and sprawling, was a patchwork of khanates, each ruled by different factions of the family. The division between the khanates created bitter rivalries, and Kublai found himself standing at the crossroads of them all. His rise to power wasn't a simple matter of inheritance, it was a contest, one that stretched across the empire, testing loyalty and resolve. His rivals, including his own brother, aroused tension and chaos, for they, too, had visions of empire. Kublai's journey was marked by struggle and sacrifice, as each victory came at the cost of something precious. The Mongol world was on fire with ambition, but Kublai could not sit idle. His vision for a unified empire stretched far beyond the horizons of the steppes. Kublai knew that if he were to succeed, he needed to do more than simply conquer lands. He needed to conquer hearts, to forge an empire where cultures could coexist. His ambition was not just to expand the Mongol domain, but to transform it. In his mind, the Mongol Empire would not remain just a Mongol empire. It would become something greater. Something new. In 1271, after years of political turmoil and fierce battles for dominance, Kublai Khan declared himself Emperor of China, officially establishing the Yuan dynasty. The title he took wasn't just a claim to power, it was a statement. The steppe-born Kublai was now the ruler of China, the Middle Kingdom, the cradle of a civilization that had stood for centuries. This was not just a shift in leadership, it was the beginning of a revolution. The Mongols had come from the vast, windswept plains, and now they ruled the most sophisticated and ancient civilization in the world. But Kublai knew the stakes. It was not enough to conquer, he had to build. The transition from the Mongol Khanate to the Yuan dynasty was not seamless. He faced the daunting task of governing a people who had long seen themselves as superior to the barbarians from the steppes. The Mongols were warriors first, and though Kublai's blood ran deep with the pride of his ancestors, he was also a man of vision, a man who understood that culture and governance were the pillars on which an empire could stand. The challenge was monumental. How could Kublai keep the Mongol warrior spirit alive while establishing rule over a people who had known their own traditions, their own ways for millennia? The policies Kublai enacted were radical in their approach. He embraced the wisdom of the past, adopting Chinese institutions and systems, but he did so with the wisdom of a man who knew that change had to come slowly, gradually. Kublai incorporated scholars, administrators, and officials from every level of Chinese society. He recognized that the strength of the empire was not just in the sword, but in the ability to govern a diverse and complex population. He sought to create a harmony between the Mongol military tradition and the Chinese bureaucratic system. It was a delicate balance, one that required immense patience and foresight. Yet, Kublai's vision was not only that of a unified government. He sought to integrate cultures, to build bridges between the Mongols and the Chinese, between the old ways and the new. His reign saw an era of unprecedented cultural exchange, one where the Mongols brought their nomadic heritage into contact with the sophistication of Chinese art, philosophy, and architecture. Trade flourished under his rule, as the famous Silk Road, both a physical and symbolic link between East and West, was revitalized. Kublai understood that empires were not just about military conquest, they were about connection, about the weaving together of ideas, people, and cultures. His court in Beijing became a center for innovation and learning, a place where scholars from across the world gathered. Kublai encouraged the work of artisans, painters, and architects, blending Mongol and Chinese influences into breathtaking works of art and architecture. The Yuan dynasty built grand palaces, temples, and cities, each a testament to the union of two cultures. But it wasn't just the physical architecture that Kublai built, it was the intangible one, the architecture of ideas that would define his legacy. But this vision came with its own struggles. Not all Mongols were content with Kublai's decisions. His policies of assimilation met resistance from some of the more traditional factions of the Mongol elite, who felt that their warrior ethos was being undermined by the softening influence of Chinese customs. At the same time, many Chinese felt uneasy under the rule of a foreign emperor, who they feared might not respect their ancient traditions. Kublai Khan, however, remained steadfast. He knew the journey ahead would not be easy, but he also knew it was the only way forward. Throughout his reign, Kublai worked to consolidate his power and ensure that the Yuan dynasty flourished. He focused on the agricultural reforms necessary to feed his vast empire, instituted a series of public works that improved infrastructure, and reformed the legal system to ensure fairness and order. The Mongol Empire had always been a harsh one, governed by the strong arm of military might. But Kublai Khan saw that the future of his empire depended on more than just power, it depended on the ability to build a just and prosperous society, one that could stand the test of time. The legacy of Kublai Khan is complicated, as all legacies are. He expanded the Mongol Empire beyond the wild steppes into one of the greatest and most diverse empires in history. He bridged cultures and eras. Yet, for all his brilliance, his reign was also marked by challenges, some of them deeply human. Not all of his policies succeeded, and not all of his subjects accepted his rule. Still, Kublai Khan's vision endured. His reign altered the course of history, shaping the world in ways that would echo for centuries to come. The Yuan dynasty stood as a testament to the man who understood that empires were not simply built on conquest, but on the capacity to evolve, to adapt, and to unite people from every corner of the world. The thunder of hooves echoed across the endless plains, a sound that seemed to shake the very earth beneath it. Bada Khan led his warriors, a relentless tide, toward lands that had once seemed distant and untouched. The land before him was foreign, yet strangely familiar, a place of vast forests, rolling rivers, and cities that held the scars of ages. The Russians had never seen an enemy like the Mongols, who came not just to conquer but to reshape everything they touched. Bada Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, knew that his mission was more than just expansion. His campaigns would leave a mark on the world that would stretch through the centuries, but the path ahead was not simple. The Mongols were warriors, born from the harsh steppe, but they were also a people of great vision, able to see beyond mere conquest. Bada's goal was not just to overwhelm, it was to establish a lasting legacy, a new order. The year 1237 marked the beginning of a transformation for the Russian lands. Bada's army swept through the Russian principalities, one after another, with an unstoppable ferocity. Cities like Ryazan, Moscow, and Vladimir fell before the Mongol onslaught. There was no mercy, no hesitation. The Mongols, and their devastating campaigns, showcased the full extent of their power, and cities that once stood as proud symbols of Slavic culture were left in ruins. The streets of the Russian cities ran red with the blood of defenders who fought bravely, but ultimately, hopelessly. For the Russian princes and their people, the Mongol invasion was a nightmare. But it was also a reality they could not escape. Bada Khan did not come to destroy without reason. He came to establish control, to set the terms of life under the Golden Horde, which would be his new domain. The Mongols were ruthless in their methods, but they were not unwise. Bada knew that in order to maintain his empire, he needed not only to conquer but also to govern. After his conquest, Bada established the Golden Horde, a Mongol state that would rule over the vast expanse of Russian lands for more than 2 centuries. The Golden Horde was not a static empire, it was a dynamic force, both feared and respected. Bada knew that simply occupying the land would not be enough. He needed to bring order to the chaos. He did this with the same strategic genius that had carried his armies across the steppe and into Russia. The tribute system became the bedrock of Mongol rule in Russia. Russian princes were forced to pay tribute to Bada Khan and acknowledge his supremacy, a system that would remain in place for generations. At first, this arrangement seemed to bring some stability to the Russian principalities. The Mongols, in their own way, ensured a semblance of order, even as they extracted wealth and resources from their subjects. The princes, now vassals of Batu, were required to provide tribute, which came in the form of gold, goods, and even military support when called upon. In exchange, they were allowed to retain their titles and control over their local territories as long as they complied with the demands of the Golden Horde. For the Russian people, this system was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, they were allowed to live under the familiar structures of their principalities. On the other, they were subject to a foreign yoke that would remain oppressive. The Mongol presence became a permanent shadow over the Russian landscape, a force that loomed large but also played a significant role in shaping the future of Russia. As the years passed, the Mongols began to weave their influence into the very fabric of Russian society. Although the Golden Horde was far from a peaceful empire, it introduced an array of new ideas and structures that would eventually contribute to Russia's development. Under Mongol rule, the Russian princes learned the art of diplomacy, negotiation, and governance on a larger scale. They also learned how to manage vast territories, much like the Mongols themselves had done. Mongol rule also had a profound effect on Russian military tactics. The Mongols, masters of cavalry and swift raids, left their mark on the Russian way of war. The Russians adapted Mongol techniques, learning how to fight with speed and flexibility, how to harry and harass their enemies before striking with precision. These lessons would serve Russia well in the centuries to come, as they eventually rose against their Mongol overlords. But the true impact of Mongol rule was not just on the battlefield. It was in the slow but steady changes to Russian culture and governance. While the Mongols did not impose their religion on the Russian people, they did bring with them new ideas that would change the course of Russian history. The Mongol emphasis on centralized power and strict governance helped to lay the foundation for the rise of the Russian Tsardom. The princes of Russia, once fractured and divided, began to consolidate their power, inspired in part by the Mongol model of centralized rule. The Golden Horde also played a role in the development of Russian trade. The Mongols, through their vast empire that stretched across Asia, had access to trade routes that connected east and west. This network, once protected and expanded by the Mongols, would eventually benefit the Russians. Russian merchants began to trade goods along the Silk Road, bringing new wealth and new ideas to the Russian cities. The influence of the Mongol world was felt across the continent, from the Middle East to Europe, and Russia was no exception. Yet, despite all the influence the Mongols brought to Russia, their rule was not one of peace and prosperity for all. The tribute system was a heavy burden for many, and the Mongols' demands often drained the resources of the Russian people. The terror of Mongol invasions remained fresh in the memories of those who had witnessed their cities fall to the horde. And for centuries, the shadow of Bada Khan's empire loomed large over Russia, a reminder of the fierce power that had once conquered them. In time, the Russian people began to chafe under the Mongol yoke. The Golden Horde weakened, and with it, the hold over Russia began to falter. Yet, even as the Mongols retreated, the legacy of their rule remained. The Russians had been changed forever. They had learned how to govern, how to fight, and how to navigate the complexities of a vast empire. Bada Khan's empire may have crumbled, but the influence of the Golden Horde was woven into the very fabric of Russian identity. And though the Mongols had gone, the echoes of their empire would continue to shape the Russian world for centuries to come. The air was thick with tension. The once mighty Mongol Empire, stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, now felt the tremors of uncertainty. The great Khans who had built this empire with fire and blood were gone, and in their absence, something darker had taken root: distrust, rivalry, and ambition. The once unyielding unity was now fractured, like a shattered mirror reflecting the broken dreams of 1,000 warriors. The empire had stretched so far, yet now it seemed to be unraveling at its seams. The death of Genghis Khan had already cast a shadow over the future of the Mongol Empire. His vision of a united world under Mongol rule had been immense, but even a man as great as he could not predict the forces that would rise in his wake. His children, his heirs, each one with their own dreams, their own desires for power, stood at the precipice of something immense. But where once there had been unity and conquest, now there was discord. The bloodline that had brought the Mongols from the endless steppe to the gates of cities across the known world was now at war with itself. The succession crises began almost immediately after the death of Genghis Khan in 1227. His empire, so vast and powerful, was left in the hands of his sons, each vying for their share of the inheritance. Temujin, who had forged the empire with blood and sweat, had promised unity. But as the years passed, the vision of a united Mongol state began to slip away, replaced by something more dangerous: a hunger for power. Every son, every general, every leader believed they deserved more. And when power is divided, the wounds that follow are deep and relentless. The first cracks appeared in the heart of the empire. The great Western campaigns, the conquests that had seemed unstoppable, began to slow down as disputes over land, wealth, and titles consumed the minds of the leaders. The once unified Mongol forces began to fracture into different khanates, each pursuing its own destiny, its own path of glory. The empire that had seemed so vast now seemed like a house of cards, ready to fall at the first gust of wind. The mighty Yuan dynasty in China, the Golden Horde in the Russian steppes, the Ilkhanate in Persia, all were born of the same blood, but each would go on to chart its own course. The infighting became a deadly game, each struggle more bitter than the last. In the Mongol court, loyalty was a rare commodity, and ambition a flame that consumed all who dared come too close. Generals turned on each other, brothers betrayed brothers, and the sons of Genghis Khan fought amongst themselves, their hearts filled with greed and envy. They sought more land, more treasure, more glory, anything to claim their father's legacy as their own. The very foundation of the empire began to crack as the once unbreakable unity gave way to chaos. The story of the Mongol Empire, which had begun with the rise of a single man, Temujin, became the story of a kingdom splintering. The great empire was no longer the force that had once commanded the respect of kings and emperors. It was now a fractured realm, with power shifting from one leader to another, alliances forming and dissolving like the desert winds. In the midst of this turmoil, the khanates grew ever more distant from one another, each ruled by those who had once stood side by side in victory, now fighting to become the singular heir to the Mongol throne. The unity that had carried the Mongols from one conquest to the next was lost. And with it came the slow decline of central authority. Genghis Khan had held it all together, his iron will the force that united them, but now the ties that bound the empire were weakening. The khanates, once part of a grand vision, became self-serving entities. They fought their own battles, made their own alliances, and followed their own paths. What was once the greatest empire in the world became a patchwork of disconnected kingdoms, each clinging to its own power, unable to see that the very thing that had made them great, unity, was slipping through their fingers. And as the empire splintered, the dream of Genghis Khan's united world became nothing more than a ghost. It was a vision that could not withstand the weight of betrayal, ambition, and fractured loyalties. What had been a brotherhood of warriors now turned into a battlefield of kings. The dreams of the father faded, and the legacy of the sons was tarnished by bloodshed and betrayal. The Mongol Empire's collapse was not sudden, it was slow, like the fading of a once bright star. Each passing year saw more infighting, more territorial disputes, and more loss of control. The great cities once held under Mongol rule, Samarkand, Baghdad, Kiev, faded into shadows as the Khanates turned inward, concerned only with their own survival. They forgot the spirit of conquest that had carried their ancestors across the world. They forgot the unity that had made them unstoppable. In the end, the Mongol Empire was not brought down by the sword of an enemy, but by the swords of its own heirs, each one cutting away at the fabric of a vision that had once been so powerful. The sons of Genghis Khan, once bound by blood and purpose, became the architects of their own empire's fragmentation. As they fought for power, they left in their wake a shattered empire that no longer resembled the one their father had built. The decline of the central authority was not merely political, it was emotional. The Mongols who had once fought together, shoulder to shoulder, now found themselves divided. They no longer shared a common dream, a common vision. Instead, they were divided by ambition, greed, and the thirst for power. And as the once great empire crumbled, the echoes of its former glory seemed to vanish, leaving only the distant memories of what had been. The world that Genghis Khan had conquered, united under a single banner, began to dissolve into the dust of history, a powerful reminder of how quickly unity can be lost and how fragile an empire truly is. The sun had barely risen over the vast Persian plains when the last remnants of the Ilkhanate began to fade into history. The once powerful empire, born from the ferocity and ambition of Hulagu Khan, now trembled on the edge of collapse. The city of Tabriz, once a bustling capital full of life and promise, had become a shadow of its former self. The markets, where traders from every corner of the world once exchanged silk and spices, were now silent. The grand palaces, once filled with the whispers of power, stood empty, their walls crumbling with neglect. Even the streets, which had once echoed with the sound of Mongol boots, now felt like a ghost town. The Ilkhanate, which had dominated Persia for over a century, was slowly unraveling. Economic and political troubles had dug deep into its foundations, eroding the stability that had once seemed unshakable. The bloodline of Hulagu Khan, whose brutal conquests had decimated entire civilizations, was now caught in the grip of inner turmoil. Rulers came and went with startling frequency, each struggling to maintain control over a realm that was slipping through their fingers. There were no great battles to mark the fall, no heroic last stand. It was a quiet collapse, a death by 1,000 cuts. At the heart of the Ilkhanate's decline was the crumbling economy. The vast wealth that had once flowed from the fertile lands of Persia had dwindled. Trade routes, once thriving with goods from China, India, and the Middle East, became less secure, plagued by bandits and infighting. Agriculture, which had been the backbone of the empire, faltered under the weight of mismanagement. Famine became a familiar companion to the people, and the once thriving cities were forced to beg for aid. The markets were no longer filled with the bounty of empire. Instead, they were filled with the desperation of a people who had seen their world crumble beneath them. Politically, the Ilkhanate faced even greater challenges. The empire, once united under the Mongol banner, was now splintered as rival factions fought for power. Successions were never smooth. One ruler after another struggled to maintain control, only to be overthrown or assassinated by those hungry for power. There was no lasting peace, no stability. The leaders of the Ilkhanate could not agree on how to govern, how to heal the wounds of a land torn apart by constant warfare. Trust had evaporated, leaving only betrayal in its wake. As the years wore on, the Ilkhanate became a fractured empire, each region pulling in a different direction, no longer bound by the unifying will of a single ruler. The central authority that had once been the beating heart of the Ilkhanate was now a distant memory, a faded dream. In the chaos, Persia's future seemed uncertain, like a ship adrift in a stormy sea, with no captain to steer it to safety. Far to the east, the Chagatai Khanate was not faring much better. The lands that had once been the foundation of Genghis Khan's empire were now riddled with the same struggles that had doomed the Ilkhanate. The Chagatai Khanate, stretched across Central Asia, was crumbling under the weight of internal divisions, tribal rivalries, and constant warfare. Its once great khans had fallen into obscurity, unable to maintain control over the diverse and scattered peoples that populated the region. The political landscape in the Chagatai Khanate was even more fractured than in Persia. Like the Ilkhanate, There was no clear line of succession, no solid leadership to hold the region together. The Khans of the Chagatai family had long since lost their grip on power, and various factions fought for control over the vast, arid steppe. Cities that had once been the heart of commerce, like Samarkand and Bokhara, were now caught in the grip of unrest. The once thriving Silk Road was no longer a lifeline for the people of Central Asia, but a series of crumbling, isolated routes where merchants risked their lives just to move a few miles. The land was torn by warlords, each seeking to carve out their own empire. Loyalty was fleeting, and alliances were forged only to be broken when it suited one of the rival factions. The military might that had once been the backbone of the Mongol Empire had fragmented. The once unified Mongol forces were now little more than scattered bands of soldiers, each fighting for their own vision of the future. The unity that had once been the hallmark of the Mongols was now a distant memory, replaced by a chaotic scramble for power and resources. The impact of the decline of both the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate rippled throughout the region. Central Asia, once a thriving hub of trade, culture, and power, became a land of fragmentation and instability. It was as though the very essence of the Mongol Empire had been eroded, piece by piece, leaving behind a barren landscape where once great cities stood. The people who had once looked to the Mongols for protection and prosperity now looked only to survive in a world that seemed to be falling apart around them. The collapse of the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate was not a single moment in history, but a slow and painful process, a death by attrition, a gradual fading of the empire's former glory. It was as if the land itself had wept for the empire that had once conquered so much. The power of the Mongol Khans had reached its peak, but now, like all things, it began to decline. The cities of Samarkand, Bokhara, Tabriz, once symbols of Mongol might, now stood as monuments to what had been lost. The echoes of the Mongol Empire's greatness faded into silence as the world moved on, forgetting the power that had once swept across continents. But the legacy of that power, the lessons of unity and division, of triumph and downfall, lived on in the stories of those who had survived. The fall of the Ilkhanate and the Chagatai Khanate marked the end of an era, but it also marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where the past was nothing more than a memory and the future was uncertain. The land had changed, but the story of the Mongols would never be forgotten. A heavy silence hung in the air as the once mighty Golden Horde, once a symbol of Mongol power across Russia, trembled under the weight of its own crumbling empire. The walls that had once echoed with the thunder of hooves and the cries of victory now felt hollow and weak. The strength that had once been forged in the blood and sweat of battles seemed to dissipate like smoke, swept away by the cold winds of change. Tamerlane's invasion was a storm that struck with fury, devastating everything in its path. In 1395, the mighty warlord swept across the plains with an unstoppable army, his eyes set on the heart of the Golden Horde. His forces, unmatched in their brutality, tore through the land, leaving nothing but destruction behind. Cities were burned to the ground, families torn apart, and the once proud cities of the Horde were reduced to ashes. The remnants of the Horde's strength, shattered by Tamerlane's relentless campaigns, were left to grapple with their survival. The Mongol dream of a united, dominant empire was beginning to fade like the dying embers of a fire. Tamerlane didn't just break the cities, he fractured the very essence of the Horde. The once unified forces of the Mongol Khans now splintered into smaller, weaker factions. The harsh winds of discord began to blow through the land. The Golden Horde, which had once stretched from the heart of Russia to the gates of Europe, was now broken into pieces: Kazan, Crimea, Astrakhan, each fighting for its own survival, its own claim to power. It wasn't just the physical destruction that took its toll, but the loss of the spirit that once held the empire together. The Mongol Khans, once so powerful and feared, no longer commanded the respect they once had. The spirit of unity, forged in the days of Genghis Khan, had been diluted by the chaos and infighting that followed Tamerlane's conquest. Now, the Khans could only watch as their power waned, each day bringing them closer to a future they could not control. But perhaps the most haunting part of the decline was the quiet rise of a new force in the east, Muscovy. The Russian principalities, once subjugated beneath the Mongol yoke, began to stir. For years, they had lived in the shadow of the Mongols, forced to pay tribute and bow to the Khan's rule. But the spirit of resistance had grown stronger with time, and the day had come when the Russian people could no longer bear the weight of their oppression. Muscovy, led by princes who had watched the Mongol Empire weaken, began to rise from the ashes of its own troubled past. They saw an opportunity, a chance to free themselves from the long, suffocating grasp of the Golden Horde. And so, they took it. The first tremors of Muscovy's power were small, barely noticeable against the backdrop of the vast empire the Horde had once commanded. But they were there, nonetheless. The Khans of the Golden Horde, already divided and weakened, were unable to stop Muscovy's steady ascent. The Russian principalities, emboldened by their own ambition and the crumbling of the Mongol power, began to unite. The Mongol dominance in the region, which had lasted for centuries, was now beginning to unravel. The Khans, their power slipping through their fingers, could only watch as Muscovy expanded, inching closer to the heart of the Horde's former empire. The Golden Horde, now a shadow of its former self, was being pushed further and further back. The fierce warriors who had once ridden into battle with an unshakable sense of pride were now scattered, fighting to hold onto whatever land they could. Yet, even as the empire disintegrated, the people of the Horde held onto something deeper. It wasn't the strength of their armies or the grandeur of their cities, it was the memory of what they had been. They were a people of the steppe, a people born of warriors and conquerors. But even the greatest empires, like the golden hooves that once thundered across the earth, must eventually fade. Kazan, Crimea, and the other fragments of the Golden Horde struggled to hold on to whatever power they had left. But no matter how hard they tried, no matter how many battles they fought, they could not escape the inevitable tide of history. The once mighty Golden Horde had fractured into pieces too small to hold back the future. The shadow of Muscovy loomed larger with each passing day, casting a cold chill over the remnants of the Horde. The Battle of Kulikovo in 1380 had been a symbol of hope for the Russian forces, a sign that the Mongols were no longer invincible. But it was not just that single battle that signaled the end, it was the steady, relentless decline of the Golden Horde that had left it vulnerable. The Khans, their ability to rule slipping away, could no longer maintain control over the vast lands they had once commanded. Their armies, weakened by years of internal strife and Tamerlane's devastating blows, were no match for the rising Russian forces. Muscovy, with its growing power, began to take hold of the land that once belonged to the Golden Horde. The once proud Mongol Empire, which had swept across continents and toppled civilizations, now faced its slow, painful death. Its territory shrank, its influence waned, and its people, once rulers of the vast Russian steppes, were now fighting for survival in a world that had passed them by. The Mongol dominance in Russia, which had once seemed so unshakable, was now gone. Muscovy, born from the ashes of oppression and fueled by the ambition of its people, had taken its place. The decline of the Golden Horde was not just the fall of an empire, it was the end of an era. The memory of the Mongol Empire would live on in the stories of the people, in the legends of the Khans and their conquests. But the land had changed. The future was no longer theirs. The steppe, once the cradle of Mongol power, now belonged to a new force, one that would shape the future of Russia and the world. The fall of the Golden Horde was not a sudden crash, but a slow, painful decay. It was the death of a dream, the fading of an empire that had once seemed invincible. And in its place, the winds of change blew, quiet at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. The steppe would never forget the Mongols, but the world had moved on. A moment of quiet stillness, an echo of something long gone, fills the air. For centuries, the world had been divided, distant lands kept apart by barriers, mountains, deserts, oceans, and thick walls of distrust. But then, like a sudden burst of wind through an ancient doorway, the world seemed to open up. The silence was broken by the hum of trade, the flow of goods, the murmur of languages crossing paths. The Pax Mongolica, the peaceful time forged by the Mongol Empire, was not just a time of tranquility. It was a golden thread woven through the vast stretches of Asia and Europe, binding them together in ways no one had ever imagined. The great highways of the Silk Road, once filled with uncertainty and danger, became vibrant arteries of trade. Merchants from distant lands, China, Persia, Italy, crossed through Mongol territory with goods that had never before touched these lands. The luxurious silks of the east, the precious spices of the south, and the rare gems of India began to make their way westward, while in return, the west offered its precious metals, wool, and other goods to the east. The markets were flooded with colors, sounds, and smells, a stark contrast to the lifeless quiet that had come before. In cities like Samarkand, Bokhara, and Baghdad, traders set up their stalls, the air thick with the scent of leather and spices, the clang of metal as goods were exchanged. Through the Mongols' vast empire, caravans could travel further than ever before, knowing that they would be safe, that the law of the Khan was law everywhere. The Mongols had created a world where merchants, once at the mercy of robbers or local rulers, could now travel freely from one end of the empire to the other. But trade was just one side of the coin. The roads were not just for goods. They were pathways for something even more powerful, ideas. Scholars, travelers, and adventurers from east and west came together, their eyes wide with curiosity as they shared knowledge that had once been locked away in the far corners of the world. The great libraries of Baghdad and Samarkand became melting pots of cultures and thoughts, where Persian philosophers met Chinese astronomers and Indian mathematicians exchanged ideas with European scientists. These exchanges planted the seeds for the Renaissance in Europe, for the great leaps in science and technology that would change the course of history. Technological innovations moved like whispers across continents. The art of papermaking from China found its way to the West, transforming communication and education. The compass, a gift from the East, guided European explorers to faraway shores, opening up the world like never before. Gunpowder, too, made its way from the East, changing the nature of warfare forever. These tiny sparks of innovation spread out across the world, setting the stage for new eras of exploration and discovery. But for all the wonders of cultural exchange, the Pax Mongolica was also a time of great tragedy. As the Mongol Empire brought the world closer together, it also allowed something else to spread, something darker, more insidious. With the same ease that goods and ideas traveled, so too did diseases. The Black Death, a shadow that would haunt humanity for centuries, spread rapidly across the Silk Road. Carried by fleas on rats and through human contact, it coursed through Mongol trade routes, first reaching the heart of Central Asia before creeping into Europe and the Middle East. It was a disease like no other, sweeping across entire cities, wiping out populations in mere weeks. The death toll was staggering, and the world, just beginning to connect, found itself shattered once more. Cities that had been thriving centers of culture and trade now stood silent, empty except for the remnants of lives lost. The terror of the plague was all-encompassing, a force of nature that showed no mercy. It spread with the same speed and fury that trade had once moved at, and its effects were felt in every corner of the world. But even in the face of such devastation, life carried on. The Pax Mongolica, with its trade and exchanges, had given the world something priceless, the knowledge that despite the darkest days, the world could come together, rebuild, and move forward. Yet, as the empire began to fracture and its unity slowly gave way to division, so too did the connection between East and West begin to loosen. The Silk Road, that vibrant highway that had once connected the world's civilizations, became fragmented, its power fading. The great Mongol Empire began to crumble, and with it, the peaceful order it had established. The cities that had once thrived under Mongol rule now found themselves caught in the tug-of-war between new empires, local rulers, and shifting powers. But the impact of the Pax Mongolica, the far-reaching influence it had on trade, culture, and technology, would never be forgotten. It was a time when the world was briefly unified, when the ideas, goods, and even the pain of the world flowed together, shaping everything that came after. In those fleeting years of peace, the Silk Road carried more than just silk and spices, it carried the hopes of an interconnected world. It carried the dreams of civilizations reaching across great distances, learning from each other, and growing stronger together. Even in the darkest moments, when disease and death seemed to have the upper hand, the light of knowledge and exchange continued to burn bright. As the world moved on, the legacy of the Pax Mongolica remained, a reminder of the delicate balance that once existed when the threads of human connection were woven tightly across the vast continents. The seeds of what had been planted during that era continued to grow, quietly shaping the course of history, leaving behind a story of how the world could, for a time, come together in ways never before seen, and how it could never quite be the same again. The ground trembles beneath the heavy pounding of hooves. The air, thick with dust and tension, is filled with the sound of war cries echoing across the open plains. In the distance, a storm of cavalry charges toward the enemy, each warrior a blur of motion, their eyes locked on the prize ahead. It's not just the speed or the ferocity that makes this attack so terrifying, it's the precision, the coordination, and the sheer force of will behind it. The Mongol army was not like anything the world had ever seen. Their approach to warfare was more than just a series of battles fought with weapons. It was a revolution in strategy, logistics, and weaponry. Every movement, every tactic was designed for one thing: victory. And when they swept across the world, they left behind a legacy that would shape the future of warfare itself. Behind every Mongol attack was a mind honed in the fires of experience. Genghis Khan and his generals didn't just rely on strength, they relied on intelligence. They understood that war was not won solely by the size of an army, but by how it was used. Mobility was key. The Mongols didn't march in a slow, lumbering fashion. Their soldiers, mounted on horseback, could move at incredible speeds. In a matter of hours, entire divisions could cover vast distances, striking where the enemy least expected it. Speed was a weapon, and the Mongols wielded it like no other. But it wasn't just the speed of their movements that struck fear into their enemies. The Mongols also understood logistics in a way that most armies did not. While many armies struggled with supply lines and communication, the Mongols had a system in place that was as efficient as it was brutal. They created a network of supply stations, set up along their campaigns, to ensure that no army, no matter how far it traveled, would ever run out of food or ammunition. They moved fast, but they never moved blindly. Perhaps one of the most terrifying aspects of the Mongol army was its use of psychological warfare. The Mongols were masters of terror. They used fear not just to defeat their enemies on the battlefield, but to destroy their will to fight before the first arrow was even loosed. Towns and cities would be taken without a single battle, their defenders surrendering before the Mongols even arrived, overwhelmed by the stories of slaughter and destruction that preceded them. The Mongols spread rumors of their brutality, often making their enemies believe that there was no hope before they even began. This tactic wasn't just about instilling fear, it was about breaking the spirit of the people they faced. The Mongols would sweep through a region, leaving destruction in their wake, and then, just as quickly, disappear. Those who survived the initial terror would flee, and by the time the enemy army arrived, the Mongols were long gone, leaving behind only chaos. It wasn't just a war of soldiers, it was a war of minds. Then there was the weaponry, the tools that brought the Mongols their victories. The bow, simple yet deadly, became a symbol of Mongol strength. The Mongol bow was not just any bow. It was a composite bow, crafted from wood, horn, and sinew, which allowed it to be smaller, more compact, and more powerful than any other bow of the time. The Mongols could shoot arrows from horseback with incredible accuracy, striking down enemies from great distances. The bow was not just a weapon, it was an extension of the Mongol warrior, as natural as breathing. The use of the horse also gave them a distinct advantage. The Mongol cavalry was a force like no other. Their horses were smaller and more agile than the heavy steeds of European knights, but they were incredibly fast and could carry the Mongols for days without tiring. A Mongol warrior could ride for hours, shoot arrows while galloping, and retreat before the enemy could even react. It was an art form, a deadly dance of speed and precision that left their foes scrambling to keep up. The Mongols' mastery of siege warfare was another aspect that left an indelible mark on the world. While they were known for their speed and shock tactics, they also understood the importance of laying siege to cities. The Mongols brought with them a host of siege weapons, huge catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams that could break down the walls of even the most fortified cities. They were relentless, their tactics refined over years of trial and error. They would surround a city, cutting off supply lines and slowly, methodically, wear down the defenders until they had no choice but to surrender. And when they did, the Mongols showed no mercy. But it wasn't just the Mongols themselves who learned from these brutal lessons. Their enemies began to understand the power of speed, coordination, and psychological warfare, too. As the Mongols pushed deeper into Europe and Asia, their tactics left behind a blueprint that other empires would follow. The Ottomans, for instance, would later adopt many of the Mongol strategies, including their use of mounted archers and siege warfare. The Mongol Empire, too, would embrace the Mongol style of warfare, using speed and precision to conquer vast lands in India. Even after the fall of the Mongol Empire, the lessons of their military genius lived on. The Ottoman and Mughal empires learned to combine the Mongol approach with their own traditions, adapting it to their needs and circumstances. The Mongols had shown the world that war could be fought with intelligence, speed, and sheer willpower, and in doing so, they transformed the very nature of battle. But the Mongols did not just change the way wars were fought, they changed the way wars were understood. They taught the world that warfare was not about brute force alone, but about strategy, planning, and timing. Every move, every tactic, was a carefully thought-out step toward victory. The Mongols showed that war was as much a game of the mind as it was a game of strength. And in the end, it was not just their weapons that made them great, it was their ability to think, to adapt, and to conquer. The Mongols may have left their mark on history with their incredible speed, their devastating tactics, and their terrifying psychological warfare, but it was their legacy of military innovation that would endure. The strategies they developed, the lessons they taught, continued to shape the future of empires long after their time had passed. In every battle that followed, and every army that took the field, the shadow of the Mongols loomed large. Their way of war became the standard, a template that others would follow, a testament to the genius of the Mongol mind. In the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire, beneath the canopy of endless skies, there was one rule that was unspoken but clear: tolerance. It wasn't just a policy, it was woven into the very fabric of Mongol governance, a crucial part of how their empire stretched from the steppes to the cities of distant lands. The Mongols, known for their fierce battles and unyielding drive, were also rulers of uncommon wisdom when it came to the question of belief. In a world torn by religious wars and ethnic strife, the Mongols stood apart, offering a surprising kind of unity to the diverse peoples they conquered. The Mongols understood one simple truth: belief was sacred, and so was the individual. For them, it wasn't about forcing people to conform to a single faith or belief. It was about ensuring peace and harmony through respect for different ways of life. This was a stark contrast to many of the empires that came before and after them, where conquest often meant imposing a singular vision on the conquered. But not in the Mongol Empire. Here, the doors to every temple, every church, and every mosque were open. Imagine the vastness of the Mongol Empire, stretching across Asia, over mountains and deserts, through cities where the fragrance of incense mingled with the sound of bells. Under their rule, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, and even traditional shamanistic beliefs all found a place. Genghis Khan himself had been born into a world where the spirits of nature and ancestral worship held sway, yet he never imposed his beliefs on his people. Instead, he encouraged an open approach to faith. This remarkable tolerance came to define the empire, as it grew not only through military might but through an understanding that different cultures and religions could coexist under one banner. In the heart of the empire, Buddhism began to flourish. The Mongols, drawn to the peaceful teachings of the Buddha, showed great reverence for Buddhist monks and scholars. They supported the building of monasteries and provided protection for religious leaders. Kublai Khan, who would become one of the most famous Mongol rulers, was especially fond of Buddhism. His court became a sanctuary for Buddhist thought, and the empire's embrace of this religion led to the flourishing of artistic and architectural works that blended Mongol and Buddhist traditions. Yet, the Mongols were not just patrons of Buddhism. They held Islam in high regard too. As the empire expanded into the Middle East, they encountered a rich, vibrant Islamic world. The Mongols did not try to stamp out Islam as many conquerors had before them. Instead, they allowed the faith to thrive under their rule. Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan, even welcomed the Islamic scholars and leaders into his court. Baghdad, once the center of the Islamic world, fell to the Mongols in 1258, but rather than erase the history and culture of the city, the Mongols made sure to respect its heritage. The remnants of the great libraries, the mosques, and the schools were preserved, a testament to the Mongol reverence for knowledge and belief. In the West, Christianity too found a place. The Mongols respected the Christian faith, often forming alliances with Christian kingdoms. They saw in Christianity a faith that, like their own, could unite people across vast lands. The Nestorian Christians, whose roots stretched deep into Central Asia, flourished under Mongol rule. The Mongols sent gifts to the Pope and even sought diplomatic relations with Christian Europe, creating a bridge between the East and West. In this vast empire, there was space for belief, for different ideas to cross boundaries and create new connections. The religious tolerance under Mongol rule wasn't just a political move, it was an expression of the empire's greater philosophy of governance. The Mongols ruled with a pragmatic understanding that peace was the true measure of success. In a time when most empires sought to impose a single worldview, the Mongols allowed people to practice their faiths freely. In their empire, a Christian might sit side by side with a Muslim or a Buddhist in a market, exchanging goods and ideas. The beauty of this approach was that it created a culture of mutual respect. People saw that their beliefs were accepted, even celebrated, and as a result, they felt secure under Mongol rule. But the Mongols didn't just tolerate the faiths of their subjects, they also embraced their artistic and cultural contributions. The Mongols were keen patrons of the arts, and their vast empire became a melting pot of different styles, techniques, and influences. This cultural exchange was not merely a political strategy but a reflection of the Mongol rulers' genuine curiosity about the world and the people they had brought under their dominion. They welcomed artists, scholars, and craftsmen from all corners of the empire, leading to a period of remarkable artistic and architectural achievement. In the cities of the Mongol Empire, the architecture began to reflect the blending of cultures. Mongol rulers, like Kublai Khan, commissioned the construction of grand palaces, temples, and mosques that fused Mongol and Chinese designs. The famous Buddhist temples in China, like the ones built during Kublai's reign, carried the distinctive marks of Mongol influence, yet they also embraced the traditional Chinese style. In the cities of Persia, Mongol rulers sponsored the construction of stunning mosques, many of which incorporated Persian and Central Asian architectural elements, creating breathtaking structures that stood as monuments to the unity of different cultures. Even in the world of art, the Mongol Empire became a canvas where ideas were shared freely. The delicate brushwork of Chinese painters influenced the artistry of Persian miniatures, while Islamic calligraphy found its way into the designs of Mongol manuscripts. It was a time when borders between cultures faded, and creativity flowed unhindered, as artists from different traditions came together to create something unique, something that could only have emerged in the vibrant, multicultural world of the Mongol Empire. But amid all the grandeur and cultural exchange, there was a subtle yet powerful force at work, the deep respect the Mongols held for knowledge. Whether it was religious texts, scientific discoveries, or artistic techniques, the Mongols understood that learning was the key to a prosperous empire. In their courts, scholars from all faiths were welcome. Christian missionaries, Islamic scholars, and Buddhist monks gathered in Mongol capitals, exchanging ideas that would later shape the course of history. The Mongols, perhaps more than any other empire in history, understood that the strength of their rule didn't just lie in their military conquests. It lay in their ability to embrace the diverse cultures and beliefs that spanned their vast lands. This spirit of tolerance created a sense of belonging in an empire that spanned continents, where people of different faiths and backgrounds could coexist in peace. The Mongols may have been feared for their military might, but their legacy also lives on in the way they shaped the world with their respect for religion, culture, and art. The Mongol Empire wasn't just a place of conquest, it was a canvas where different beliefs and traditions could come together, creating a masterpiece of unity. History is often shaped by the stories we tell, and the Mongols have been the subject of stories for centuries, stories that span the spectrum from awe to fear. Genghis Khan, the name alone stirs images of ruthless conquests, of cities burned to the ground, and of an empire that stretched further than any before it. But history is rarely ever as simple as a single narrative. The Mongols, fearsome and misunderstood, have been cast in many different lights, depending on the era and the culture telling their story. In the lands they conquered, the Mongols were often remembered with a mixture of horror and respect. To many in China, the Mongols were invaders who devastated their cities, destroyed cultural monuments, and imposed a foreign rule. The destruction of the Song dynasty and the fall of ancient Chinese capitals left scars that would last for generations. But in the vast stretches of the steppes, the Mongols were something else entirely. To the nomadic tribes, they were heroes, men who rose from humble beginnings to establish one of the most powerful empires in history. For them, Genghis Khan represented the triumph of unity and strength. He became a symbol of pride, a figure to be honored and remembered. Yet, across the world, in places like Persia and Russia, the story of the Mongols took on different shades. To the people of Baghdad, the Mongols were conquerors who burned the city to the ground, leaving behind nothing but ashes and sorrow. The siege of Baghdad in 1258 was not just a military defeat, it was the death of a great civilization, the loss of libraries, scholars, and knowledge. For centuries, the Mongols were seen as destroyers, figures of terror who swept through lands, leaving devastation in their wake. In Russia, the story was similar. The Mongols ruled with an iron fist, imposing tribute on the Russian principalities, forcing them into submission. The Grand Duchy of Moscow, which would eventually rise to challenge Mongol rule, spent over 200 years under the shadow of the Golden Horde. To the Russian people, the Mongols were a source of deep resentment, a constant reminder of foreign domination. Yet even in the heart of this struggle, there were those who saw the Mongols in a different light. Some admired their military strategies, their organizational genius, and the ways in which they brought distant lands together. Over time, as the Russian state grew stronger and pushed back against Mongol dominance, the story of the Mongols became one of both caution and admiration. In the West, where tales of Genghis Khan and his conquests filtered through the trade routes and diplomatic channels, the Mongols were often seen as invincible warriors, brutal and barbaric, yet undeniably effective. They were described as the scourge of civilization, the embodiment of destruction. But there were also those who saw them as a force of nature, a power that reshaped the map of the world in ways that no one could ignore. The Mongols' military prowess and their ability to unite such a vast and diverse empire inspired both fear and awe. Yet, as the centuries passed, the myth of Genghis Khan and his empire began to shift. No longer just a conqueror, Genghis Khan became a symbol of strength and tenacity. His legacy, in many ways, became a paradox, feared for his violence, yet revered for his vision. In modern times, the story of the Mongols has been reevaluated, softened in some places, and amplified in others. Genghis Khan is no longer just a figure of terror but a symbol of national pride in Mongolia, where he is regarded as the founder of their nation. Statues of him stand tall, and his image is woven into the fabric of their identity. The Mongol Empire, with its extraordinary achievements, is seen through a new lens, one that celebrates the empire's cultural contributions, the way it facilitated trade, and the way it connected East and West. People in Mongolia remember Genghis Khan not just as a warrior, but as a statesman who brought order to a fractured world. Yet, the legacy of the Mongols is not just about conquest. Over the centuries, the world has come to appreciate the cultural and economic exchanges that the Mongol Empire facilitated. Under the Pax Mongolica, ideas, goods, and technologies flowed between continents. The Mongols opened the Silk Road like never before, creating pathways for trade and communication that helped shape the course of history. From the invention of gunpowder to the spread of paper, the Mongols were, in many ways, the unwitting bearers of ideas that would change the world forever. But even as the Mongols are celebrated for their contributions, the darker sides of their legacy remain. The stories of massacre and destruction, of entire cities razed to the ground, continue to haunt the historical memory. In the Middle East, the fall of Baghdad and the devastation of the Persian cities are still remembered with sorrow and grief. In Russia, the memory of Mongol rule is tied to centuries of hardship and subjugation. The Mongols, for all their achievements, left behind a world forever altered by their presence, a world that still grapples with the scars they left. And then there are the myths, the stories that have grown around the Mongols over time. Some say Genghis Khan was an almost superhuman figure, an unstoppable force who shaped the world with his own hands. Others claim that the Mongol Empire was a fluke, a fleeting moment in history, brought about by chance and opportunism. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. The Mongols were human, driven by ambition and vision, but they were also capable of extraordinary feats of strategy and organization. What remains from the Mongols' legacy is not just the brutality of their conquests or the awe of their military prowess. It's the lessons they left behind, lessons about leadership, about the importance of unity, and about the ability to adapt to new circumstances. The Mongols, for all their fierceness, knew how to build and govern an empire. They understood the value of knowledge, of respect for other cultures, and of the power that comes with bringing diverse peoples together. They were conquerors, yes, but they were also statesmen, diplomats, and visionaries. Today, we look back on the Mongols with a mixture of reverence and fear. We remember them for the terror they brought, but we also remember them for the connections they forged, the innovations they spread, and the world they left behind. The Mongols, with all their contradictions, continue to teach us lessons about power, about governance, and about the fragile nature of empires. Their story, ever-changing and ever-relevant, is one of both destruction and creation, a reminder that from the ashes of war, new worlds can be born.